as we begin to look at Sabbath, and particularly its meaning on a Labor Day weekend, I invite you to hear God's Word through our Bible readings this morning. So our Old Testament reading comes from the Old Testament, from the book of Genesis. So we begin at the beginning. And we read from chapter 2 of Genesis in the first 3 verses. Hear God's word for us this holy day. Thus the heavens and the earth were completed in all their vast array. By the 7th day, God had finished the work he had been doing. So on the 7th day, God rested from all the work. Then God blessed the 7th day and made it holy, because on it God rested from all the work of creating that had been done. Our New Testament reading comes from the Gospel according to Mark, and from the 2nd chapter as well, verses 23 to 28. Jesus is Lord of the Sabbath. One Sabbath, Jesus was going through the grain fields, and as his disciples walked along, they began to pick some heads of grain. The Pharisees said to him, "Look, what are they doing? This is unlawful on the Sabbath." And Jesus answered, "Have you never read what David did when he and his companions were hungry and in need? In the days of Abiathar, the high priest, he entered the house of God and ate consecrated bread, which is lawful only for priests to eat. And he also gave some of his companions. Then he said to them, 'The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord, even of the Sabbath.'" This is God's holy word for us this day. You want to come up here with me, Lindley? So this morning, we are talking about how God rested. Because we know that God created the world, created everything out of nothing, and then God rested. That's fair, isn't it? How do you rest? When in a day do you rest? At nighttime. That's the only time, she says. So that question goes to all of you too. When do you rest? I think a lot of us are exactly like Lindley in that the only time we rest is in the evening when we finally put our head to a pillow. But God wants us to rest more than just that. And on this Labor Day weekend, it's a call for us to find rest in the midst of our day, in the midst of our week, to honor God by finding time for Sabbath. Because Sabbath means rest. So we're going to think about that today. Would you pray with me? We'll echo prayer, can we? Dear God, thank you for helping us rest. For helping us rest. We pray this in your Son's name. Pray this in your Son's name. Amen. Thank you, Lindley. So, some of you that were here last week got a challenge. And so I want to check in on your past week and how it went to find some intentional Sabbath. So I actually gave you several challenges. One was to find 5 minutes a day to do nothing. Sit and be still, seeking time with God. And build that up to at least 15 minutes, or try for 15 minutes during the week. Then I asked folks to match that time with 5 minutes, building up to 15 if you could, and doing something restful that you enjoy. Because rest doesn't necessarily mean sleeping, and rest doesn't necessarily mean stopping and doing nothing. And then I asked you to find some time just to be with God. Sitting in prayer, quiet and listening for God, devotion or scripture reading. How'd it go? Anybody find some time? Karen, were you able to find some time?
Yes and no.
Okay. Jeannie?
I didn't do very good.
That's fair. Charlotte?
Like the doing the devotions and the finding a little bit of time to do something peaceful that I enjoy. I find it hard to find that 5 minutes of total quiet.
Total quiet. Bart? Right. Yeah. Starting back to school and with students. I get it. And I told you that I was going to do it too. And it is hard. I, like Charlotte, have the space for devotion and prayer, but that isn't sitting still and doing nothing. And that sitting still and doing nothing is extremely hard. And even learning last week that in a Jewish tradition, the day begins as the sun sets, which was intriguing to me to think that my day actually starts at the most restful time of my day. So, once 5:30 is there, that's usually, not with meetings, night meetings, but usually that's the calmest part of my day, other than first thing in the morning. And so it was just an intriguing, but it didn't give me quiet time. But that time to be restful and do something you enjoy, I think is important, because that's the renewal, and I think we'll hear some of that today. So good for you for trying, thank you, and I encourage all of you to try that in the week ahead, and I'm going to give you another tool today. But finding that place,
Well, I wasn't here, but see, I'm a reader, and I could start first thing in the morning and never move out of my chair till dark.
and that would be some Sabbath, absolutely.
But sometimes when I read, then I close the book, and I never thought about it till you mentioned it, but I think I'm so thankful that maybe my life isn't like what I was reading in this book.
Right, because it gives you some perspective.
Because I mean, the book is kind of, depending on which one I have,
Right.
Right now I'm reading about one where the women are trying to start a union. I mean, they work a 70-hour week for $9. Yeah. And this was back in the early 17, 18, even 1929.
Wow.
Wow. I mean,
Yeah,
we have a lot to be thankful for.
indeed. That's a great perspective. Thank you for sharing that. There are many ways for us to find rest. And sometimes that rest, renewal, refreshing, recreating comes from just doing something we enjoy, like reading. Even working outdoors. I mean, yes, technically that's work, but if it's something you enjoy doing in God's great creation, sometimes it's just sitting in our car as we drive into town or back, just us. And even the space to talk out loud, or the space to just be able to think. Or just be still as we drive. So it seems appropriate on this Labor Day weekend that we explore the concept and the commandment of Sabbath. If ever there was a day designated on the calendar to rest, to Sabbath, to not work or labor, honoring God's commandment, tomorrow is it. Labor Day was created to honor the American labor movement and the contributions that workers have made to the development, growth, endurance, strength, security, prosperity, productivity, sustainability, persistence, structure, and well-being of our country. Beginning in the late 19th century, as the trade union and labor movements grew, it was proposed that a day be set aside to celebrate labor. Labor Day became an official federal holiday in 1894. Labor means to exert one's power of body or mind, especially with work, or to strive for, effect, or achieve. It also means to burden. Labor Day is a day to cease labor, to not work, which would be honoring the definition of Sabbath. Sabbath comes from the Hebrew word Shabbat, which means to cease or to rest. Sabbath was a radically new concept to the part of the world in which the nation of Israel lived in the Old Testament times. Their neighbors, such as the Babylonians, didn't practice a day of rest each week. The Babylonian calendar had certain days on it where work stopped, but only because the day was deemed evil. So the Israelites stood out among their neighbors for having this day dedicated to worship, prayer, and rest. In Genesis, we heard that on the seventh day of creation, God was finished. God rested. God took a Sabbath. God rested not because of weariness or hard work, but because nothing formless or empty remained. God's creative work was complete. It was totally effective, absolutely perfect, matter of fact, very good. It did not have to be repeated, repaired, or revisited. And the Creator rested to commemorate it, to celebrate the completion. While the word Sabbath is not used here, the Hebrew verb translated rested is the origin of the noun Sabbath. Because God rested, we rest as well, since we are created in the image of God. It is about our relationship with God and with others. Sabbath didn't stop at the people of God taking the seventh day off from labor to rest. There was also the Sabbath of the seventh year as well. Moses also commanded the Israelites to give their land a Sabbath. 1 out of every 7 years, the fields were not to be planted, and the ground was given a chance to rest. Not only did this preserve the nutrients in the soil, but it also reminded the people that the land was not theirs. It belonged to God. Servants were also set free in the seventh year. If any of your people, Hebrew men or women, sell themselves to you and serve you 6 years, in the seventh year you must let them go free. And when you release them, do not send them away empty-handed. Supply them liberally from your flock, your threshing floor, and your winepress. Give to them as the Lord your God has blessed you. From Deuteronomy 15:12. Also, at the end of every 7 years, you must cancel debts. Every creditor canceled any loan that they had made to a fellow Israelite, no longer expecting any payment, since the Lord's time for canceling debts had been proclaimed. Sabbath, the seventh day of rest, the seventh year of resting the field, freeing servants, and being free from debt. Sabbath, a rest and freeing experience for the people of God. Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that is in them, but he rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. This fourth commandment was the first labor law on the books. Here God defines the work week. The trust the Israelites are invited to live in through this command is a radical trust in God. What a giant shift to go from many generations of slavery, some 400 years under Pharaoh, to a generation here of absolute and total dependence on God in the wilderness. Both rigorous but fairly simple and very clear-cut ways to live. Working for a tyrant who gave no time off or breaks in the work schedule, to now owning land, having power, shaping and living in a society with all the complications and messiness that comes with that. In case the wilderness manna wasn't enough, in case water from a rock wasn't enough, God says, practice the resting every seventh day. It's a must. It's required. God is to be trusted to provide. In case letting the field rest in the seventh year and forgiving all debts of your fellow neighbor and freeing your servants wasn't enough after the sixth year, God says the practice of resting is a must. It's required. God is to be trusted to provide. Trust in the God that allows you to forgive debts, that keeps you fed while you don't plant crops, that keeps you in business while you release your workforce. You are trusting that God will provide. Keeping Sabbath is a radical source of trust. God is God, and we are not. Therefore, as creatures of our Creator, we're invited to join with God in the ongoing meeting of one another's needs. This is the way of freedom and trust. The people of God practiced Sabbath. The Israelites, the Hebrews, the Jewish community, even in the New Testament times, practiced Sabbath. They practiced this way of freedom and trust. Mark's gospel tells us one of the Sabbath stories, where Jesus is challenged by the Pharisees. Here, the disciples are picking some heads of grain on the Sabbath, which is fine. There is nothing really wrong with the action itself. Deuteronomy 23:25 clarifies that. If you enter your neighbor's grain field, you may pick kernels with your hands, but you must not put a sickle to the standing grain. What is unlawful on the Sabbath, according to Jewish tradition, is the work of harvesting. Technically, according to the Pharisees, that is what Jesus' disciples were doing on the Sabbath. But Jesus challenges their perspective of Sabbath by sharing an Old Testament story. The relationship between the story of David feeding his companions some of the consecrated bread from the priest's table and the disciples' actions is in the fact that on both occasions, godly men did something perceived as forbidden. Since, however, it is always lawful to do good and to save a life, even on the Sabbath. For the disciples, they were within the spirit of the law. The Sabbath was made for humans, not humans for the Sabbath. Jewish tradition had so multiplied the requirements and restrictions for keeping the Sabbath that the burden had become intolerable. Jesus cut across these traditions and emphasized the God-given purpose of the Sabbath, a day intended for the benefit of people and the community for spiritual, mental, and physical restoration. For the people and the community. That is the kind of Sabbath that we are challenged to practice in today's world. Sabbath time intended for the benefit of people, for the whole community, for our spiritual, mental, and physical restoration. In agricultural culture of the past, and even some today, the Sabbath is caring for the animals, but it is community forming. In a rural community, as we know, you come together from the fields, from the homes, from the outskirts of town to gather together. Not withdrawing by yourself on the Sabbath, but gathering together in community. You do not go over to your neighbors and help in the field. You go over to share the Sabbath, to rest and gather around the table and share a meal. Sabbath is about resting in community. Sabbath is about connecting to God and to our neighbor. Theologian Walter Brueggemann writes, Sabbath is not about worship. It is about work stoppage. It is about withdrawing from the anxiety system of Pharaoh, the refusal to let one's life be defined by production and consumption as the endless pursuit of private well-being. Sabbath is a practice. And Sabbath does two things. It reminds us whose we are, and it shows us who we are. When we withdraw from a world that defines us mostly by what we produce or consume, we return to our essential belonging in God, the one who calls us into freedom and wholeness. This is sometimes intimidating, and it can be hard to accomplish. We need the space to relax, to renew, to refresh. And in the space Sabbath creates, we discover that time stretches out, that joy goes deeper, and we gratefully recognize God's presence in the moments of an ordinary day. Cara Root, a Presbyterian pastor in Minneapolis, whose congregation intentionally created Sabbath, even in their worship patterns, helped the congregation remember their purpose by having the children of the church create a card with the acronym REST. R for relax. E, enjoy. S, C. And T, take your new insights and awareness into the week. Relax, enjoy, see, and take new insights and awareness into the week. They also added a piece of paper in the worship bulletin that says two things. First, today I say yes to, and you fill in the blank. What would give me joy and peace and fill me with delight? What do I long for today that connects me to God, myself, and others? And then second, today I say no to, fill in the blank. What can I stop doing to remember I'm free? What worry, task, belief, or practice do I feel owned by? What can I put down so that I will recognize I belong to God and not to anything else seeking to dictate my life? Today I say yes to, and today I say no to. Members in her congregation have experienced Sabbath in a rich variety of ways. Touring a butterfly exhibit, visiting relatives, taking leisurely walks, baking cookies, sharing with a child, reading on the front porch, writing in a journal. Some engage in deep conversations, while others experiment with silence and solitude. Sabbath is an opportunity to rest in God's presence. The Sabbath was made for humans, not humans for the Sabbath. God blessed the seventh day and hallowed it. Set it aside to be honored. And we are created in God's image, therefore we are to rest as God does. God's own rest is life-giving. Healing on the Sabbath, feeding others, or eating on the Sabbath is life-giving. Therefore, Jesus and his disciples are not breaking a commandment. It is the renewal that comes to us through the Sabbath, through our rest. Life itself is a gift and comes out of the renewal and rest. Inactivity, doing nothing, is not really what Sabbath is all about. Sabbath keeping is about grace. The heart of Sabbath is our connection with God, resting in God, working on our relationship with God. Sabbath is God's gift to us, the created. Sabbath rest in God is a necessity for us on a weekly basis in order to preserve and nurture our souls. Given the pace of our lives today, however, we may slip or even be unable to remember the Sabbath. So how can we practice Sabbath rest? This morning I want to share with you the moment Sabbath. The moment Sabbath links an ordinary, recurring event with a moment's pause to recall God's love and presence with you. Here's how it works. I want you to choose an ordinary, reoccurring event in your daily life. Think about that. Maybe it's opening the door and leaving the house, turning the key in your car's ignition, turning a light on in a room, taking your first sip of coffee or tea in the morning, brushing your teeth. Think of that ordinary, reoccurring event in your daily life. Then each day in a period of silent prayer, as you complete that action, that event, you lift up just a thanksgiving. Take a deep breath and remember the Sabbath. Quiet your mind just for that moment. And remember that God is present with you then and for the rest of the day. Give that moment, Sabbath, to God. It may just be a matter of seconds or minutes, but you have taken a moment, Sabbath. And how might your day or even your week be transformed if you are able to prayerfully acknowledge God's presence in the midst of a moment Sabbath each day? If the rules of this world are off the table, if we can no longer assess our value and our standing by how productive, successful, or good we are, the remaining grace and invitation to simply abide in the love that claims us can take over. It might feel uncomfortable, but it's worth it. We too can find ourselves shifting from slavery to freedom, awakened from death into life, feel our joy made complete, and experience rest for our souls. If we can stop just enough and let God meet us just where we were, where we are, and as we are, keeping Sabbath can help us quiet our distracted minds and listen for that still, small voice. It can teach us to be and not always do. We can center ourselves for the next day or the week to come. Pastor Ruth says, Sabbath is like discovering an 8th day of the week. Try finding Sabbath rest in the midst of your busyness. Try setting aside 15 minutes every day to just rest in God. And try the moment Sabbath every day this week. Try finding an 8th day in the week for God's Sabbath. May it always be so. Amen.